Here is the cruelest irony you will ever encounter in love. The person who made you feel the most seen, the most wanted, the most electric, is the same person who looked at all of that and decided to leave. Not because it wasn't real, not because you were wrong about the connection, but because it was too real, because you were too right, because something inside them looked at something beautiful and said, I can't. And you've been sitting with that ever since. You've been trying to make sense of a math that doesn't add up. How does someone who pulled you close also push you away? How does someone look at you like you're the answer and then treat you like you're the problem? How does love, actual love, become the very thing that triggers someone to disappear? That's what this is about. Not to give you false hope, not to make excuses for someone who hurt you, but to hand you the truth, even when it stings. Because understanding this might be the only thing that finally lets you breathe again. What avoidant attachment actually feels like from the inside. Most people think avoidants don't feel much. They seem calm when you're falling apart. They seem unbothered when you're desperate for connection. They pull away without visible grief, without the kind of anguish that would at least make the rejection make sense. So the natural conclusion is, they didn't care. They never really cared. You were projecting. You were alone in this. But that conclusion is almost always wrong. Avoidant attachment isn't the absence of feeling. It's the overwhelming presence of it, combined with a nervous system that learned, very early on, that feelings are dangerous, that needing someone leads to pain, that closeness is a trap, that love, in its fullest form, will eventually cost them something they cannot afford to lose. This isn't a personality flaw. It's a survival strategy, a very old one. When a child grows up in an environment where their emotional needs were consistently dismissed, minimized, or met with irritation, they adapt. They learn to self-contain. They learn to shrink their inner world. They learn that the safest version of themselves is the one that doesn't need anything from anyone. They become fluent in emotional independence, not because they want to, but because dependence was too risky. And then they grow up, and they meet you. The moment it becomes a problem here is where it gets complicated. Here is where the story turns. Because an avoidant doesn't walk into love knowing they're going to run. They don't have a plan. They're not manipulating you. In the beginning, they are genuinely there, curious, drawn in, maybe even surprised by how much they feel. Avoidants are often magnetic in early stages of connection. They're self-contained in a way that reads as confidence. They don't chase, which makes them feel valuable. They don't overwhelm, which makes them feel safe. They're present in a way that feels rare, because they're not performing need, not rushing toward commitment, not smothering the early spark with desperation. You feel seen by them because they're actually paying attention. They're not distracted by their own anxiety in the early phase. They're curious about you, genuinely, and something starts to build. For a while, it's perfect, or close to it. There's depth, there's warmth, there's a kind of intimacy that surprises even them. They start to lower the walls, not intentionally, not strategically, just organically. The way walls come down when someone finally feels safe enough to stop guarding. But then a threshold gets crossed. It's not always dramatic. It's not always a fight or a moment of crisis. Sometimes it's something devastatingly small, a moment of vulnerability that slipped out, a future plan that suddenly felt real, a realization that they actually miss you when you're gone, and the nervous system fires. The alarm that goes off without permission. You need to understand what happens inside an avoidant when intimacy deepens, because without this, nothing else makes sense. Their system doesn't experience increasing closeness as warmth. Not entirely. There's warmth, yes, but alongside it, underneath it, woven through it, there is alarm. Ancient alarm. The kind that doesn't respond to logic. The nervous system doesn't know the difference between then and now. It doesn't know that you are not the parent who dismissed them. It doesn't know that this relationship is not the same as the one that taught them love was unsafe. It only knows that the stakes are rising, that someone has gotten inside, that there is now something, someone, to lose. And loss, for an avoidant, is not just a future fear, It's a body memory, a place they've already been. They don't consciously remember learning that love leads to loss, but their nervous system never forgot. So when the relationship deepens, something in them starts scanning, looking for evidence, noticing your flaws in a way they didn't before, not because you've changed, but because their system needs an exit strategy. It needs a reason to leave before they get left. It needs to feel like deactivating is a choice, not a wound. The avoidance starts to pull back. Physically, emotionally, they become harder to reach. The warmth cools. The presence that drew you in starts to flicker. And you, understandably, panic. Your panic and why it confirms their fear. Here is where the tragedy compounds itself. Because what do you do when someone starts pulling away? You move toward them. That's the natural response. That's what love does. It closes the gap. It reaches. It asks. It tries to reconnect. But for an avoidant, your movement toward them isn't experienced as love. It's experienced as confirmation. Their nervous system, already in a low hum of alarm, now receives what it believes is evidence. This person needs too much. This is getting too heavy. This is exactly what I was afraid of. And the pull toward distance intensifies. This is not a character flaw in you. Reaching for connection when you feel disconnected is healthy. It's what secure attachment looks like. But in the context of this particular dynamic, it triggers the exact opposite of what you need. The more you reach, the more they retreat. The more they retreat, the more you reach. And somewhere in that loop, both of you lose the thread entirely. You start to feel crazy, excessive, like your need for basic reassurance is somehow too much, too loud, too demanding. You start to wonder if you're the problem, if you want too much, if you should have been cooler, more distant, less present. None of that is true. But the dynamic teaches you to doubt yourself, and that doubt is one of the most lasting injuries this kind of relationship leaves behind. What they're actually protecting, the avoidant, is not protecting themselves from you. Read that again, because it matters. They are not running from you specifically. They are running from the version of themselves that would exist if they fully surrendered to love. The version that needs. The version that could be hurt. The version that might ask for something and be told no. For someone who built an entire internal architecture around not needing, needing feels like annihilation, not discomfort, not vulnerability, annihilation, as though the very act of depending on someone could erase the self they've spent their whole life constructing. Think of it like a fortress, not built out of arrogance, not built out of coldness, but built stone by stone out of necessity. Built by a child who learned that the gates had to stay closed to stay safe. And now that fortress is so old, so familiar, so deeply theirs, that even when someone comes in peace, bearing no weapons, the guards still draw their bows, because the guards don't ask why someone is approaching. They only register that the walls are being touched. This is what you were up against, not their indifference, their terror. The deactivation strategies they use without realizing. When an avoidance system gets overwhelmed, it deploys what psychologists call deactivating strategies. These are mental and behavioral moves designed to reduce the perceived threat of intimacy. And here's what's particularly brutal. Most avoidants don't consciously choose these. They don't sit down and strategize. The mind produces them automatically the way a body produces adrenaline. They start focusing on your flaws, not in a cruel, calculated way. Their mind genuinely begins to magnify incompatibilities, to build a mental case for why this isn't right. It's a protective narrative. If they can convince themselves the relationship isn't good enough, leaving becomes a decision rather than a retreat. They fantasize about being alone. They start idealizing their solitude, their independence, their life before you. Not because they don't value you, but because their mind is searching for evidence that they'll be okay without you, that they don't need this, that the fortress is still standing. They compare you to an idealized, unavailable alternative, an ex who's gone, someone unattainable, not because that person is better, but because that person is safe. A fantasy doesn't ask for emotional presence. A memory doesn't create real stakes. They check out during conflict. When things get emotionally intense, the avoidant often shuts down or becomes eerily calm. They stonewall. They go quiet. This isn't strength. It's a freeze response. The nervous system has decided the threat is too great, and the safest move is to stop engaging entirely. And to you, watching all of this from the outside, it looks like they don't care. It looks like you never mattered. But you're watching someone drown in slow motion, in a pool that to everyone else looks perfectly still. The particular pain of loving an avoidant, there is a specific grief that comes with this. It doesn't feel like ordinary heartbreak. Ordinary heartbreak is painful, but it's clean. Someone didn't love you the way you needed. Someone chose differently. It hurts, and then, slowly, eventually, it ends. But this grief has a hook in it, because you felt the love. You felt how real it was. You have memories of who they were when their guard came down, of moments where the fortress opened and something true came through. And those memories make it impossible to simply walk away from the idea of them, because you're not grieving the person they were pretending to be. You're grieving the person they actually are, the one you briefly, undeniably met, the one who looked at you with something unguarded in their eyes, the one who said your name like it meant something. That person was real. That's the part that destroys you. You know what's in there, and you can't unknow it. You can't unfeel the realness of it. So you stay tethered, not to an illusion, but to a truth that is simply inaccessible to you right now. That's not delusion. That's not weakness. That's what happens when love is real, but the container isn't ready to hold it. Why they left when it was good. This might be the most disorienting part of the whole experience. They didn't leave when things were bad. They didn't leave after a fight, after a betrayal, after something went genuinely wrong. They left, or started to withdraw, when things were good, when the connection was deep, when the future started to look real, when love was most present. And that timing feels insane. From the outside, it feels like self-sabotage, like throwing away a gift for no reason. But for an avoidant, the goodness of the relationship is precisely what triggered the fear, because bad relationships are easy to leave. They provide justification, but a good relationship, a genuinely nourishing, growing, deepening connection, that creates real stakes. That creates something worth losing, and something worth losing is something that can wound. So the closer you got, the more they had to lose, and the more they had to lose, the louder the alarm became. The better it felt, the more dangerous it was. They didn't run because you weren't enough. They ran because you were. Because the love was real enough to feel like a genuine threat to the self they'd built around not needing love. How do you argue with that? How do you comfort someone out of a fear that is written into their nervous system that lives below the reach of reason? You can't. And that's the unbearable part. The love that couldn't land here is a truth that sits in the chest like a stone. They may have loved you in the fullest way they currently know how to love. That might not feel like enough. It probably isn't enough for what you needed and deserved. But it matters, because it changes the story you've been telling yourself. Because somewhere in your mind, you've been running a loop, asking what was wrong with you, what you could have done differently, why you weren't lovable enough to make them stay. And that loop is based on a false premise, that if the love were real, it would have been enough to override the fear. But love for an avoidant doesn't override the fear. Love is the fear. The deeper the love, the louder the alarm. The more real you became to them, the more urgent the need to create distance. Their love for you didn't fail to show up. It showed up and then got swallowed by a system that doesn't yet know how to stay when the stakes are this high. Think of it this way. Imagine carrying a cup that has a hole in the bottom. Someone fills it for you, again and again. The filling is real. The water is real, but the cup can't hold it. The hole was there long before you arrived. You were never the problem. The cup was always already broken. The dismissal that felt personal. When they minimized the relationship, when they said it wasn't that serious, or that they just need space, or that they don't really know what they want, it felt like a verdict about you. It felt like they were saying you had imagined the whole thing, that the intimacy was one-sided, that you had built something in your head that didn't exist in theirs. But that's not what was happening. The dismissal of the relationship's significance is another deactivating strategy. If they can retroactively shrink the relationship in their own mind, make it smaller, make it less meaningful, make it something easily walked away from, then leaving doesn't carry the weight of loss. It becomes a choice rather than a grief. They are not telling you the relationship wasn't meaningful. They are telling themselves a story that makes leaving survivable. The rewriting of history, the sudden coolness, the revisionism about what the two of you were, is not evidence that you were wrong. It's evidence of how frightened they are. Because you don't need to minimize something that was never important to you. You only minimize what actually mattered. The dismissal is, paradoxically, proof of the love. What they're doing right now, if they've pulled away, if they've created distance, if they've gone quiet, there is a version of what's happening inside them that you've never been shown. Because avoidants don't stop feeling when they leave. They compartmentalize, they suppress, they keep themselves busy, they keep themselves moving, they build walls of distraction between themselves and what they actually feel. But the feeling is there. Many avoidants cycle through something after withdrawal that looks, from the inside, like a strange cocktail of relief and emptiness. The relief is the alarm quieting, the threat of intimacy reduced, the walls back in place, the self-containment restored, and for a moment, that relief feels like confirmation, like the right decision. But beneath the relief is something hollower, the absence of you. Not as a dramatic ache, avoidants don't always experience longing in the clean, legible way that anxiously attached people do, but as a kind of ambient grey, a flatness, a sense that the world has lost a colour it used to have. They won't necessarily name it as missing you. They'll rationalize it. They'll call it being tired. They'll fill the space with productivity or surface-level socializing, or the strange comfort of solitude. But the grey is there, and sometimes, in the quiet, in the night, in the unguarded moments they can't schedule away, they think of you, not with a plan, not with a realization or a resolution, just you, just the fact of you, what you sounded like, what it felt like to be known by you. And then they push it down, because feeling it means letting the alarm back in, means admitting the walls aren't as solid as they need them to be. The fantasy of return, you need to hear this gently and directly. The hope that they will return, that they will figure it out, that the love will be enough to eventually bring them back. That hope is real, and it is also the thing that keeps you from fully healing. Not because return is impossible. Sometimes avoidants do the work. Sometimes the grief of leaving is finally louder than the fear of staying. Sometimes they seek out therapy, do the excavation, and come back with something more integrated than what they had before. That happens. It's real. But here's the thing. You cannot heal while holding your breath for them, because healing requires grief, and grief requires accepting the loss. If you're waiting for them to return and fix everything, you're not grieving. You're suspending. You're living in a parenthesis, in a pause, in a conditional state where your life only resumes if they come back. And they may not. And even if they do, the version of them that could maintain a healthy relationship with you isn't the version that left. That version requires work that only they can do in a timeline you cannot control. Your healing cannot be contingent on their growth. That's not giving up on love. That's claiming your own life back from a story that hasn't decided its ending yet. What? You internalized that wasn't yours. The relationship left you with things that don't belong to you, beliefs that were handed to you without your consent, and that have taken up residence in the deepest part of how you see yourself. The belief that you are too much, that your need for closeness is a flaw, that wanting reciprocity is somehow demanding, that the truest form of love requires you to shrink yourself to a size that doesn't threaten anyone. None of that is true. You didn't become too much. You became too much for someone who could not yet handle the full volume of real love. That is a distinction that matters enormously. There is a difference between being overwhelming and being with someone who is underwhelmed by design. There is a difference between being needy and being with someone whose system treats need as danger. There is a difference between being the problem and being the person standing in front of someone who cannot yet receive what you're offering. The water was never the problem. The cup was. And you have spent months, maybe years, adjusting the pressure of your love, second guessing the depth of your feeling, editing yourself down to something smaller and more manageable, all to fit inside a vessel that was never built to hold you. Let that sink in. Let yourself feel the weight of that, because that ending, that recognition, is where the healing begins. Not in figuring out how to reach them, not in decoding their behavior, in reclaiming the parts of yourself you quietly handed over in the hope that making yourself smaller would finally make them stay. The attachment wound they carry. To understand the avoidant is not to excuse them, it's to see them clearly. And seeing them clearly is actually the thing that frees you, because it removes them from the pedestal and the villain role simultaneously and places them exactly where they are, a wounded person doing the most they currently know how to do. Avoidant attachment most commonly develops in environments where emotional expression was met with withdrawal, impatience, or dismissal. The child who cried and was told to stop. The child who was excited and was met with disinterest. The child who reached for comfort and found only distance. Over time, that child learns to stop reaching. They learn that the internal world, its needs, its longings, its soft, tender places, is better left private, hidden, managed alone. They learn that self-sufficiency is not just a value, but a survival requirement. They learn that needing people is the fastest way to be disappointed by them. And then, that child becomes an adult who is profoundly uncomfortable with their own emotional needs, who genuinely believes, on a deep unconscious level, that they are better off alone. Not because they don't want connection, they want it desperately, in ways they cannot even fully admit to themselves, but because the neural pathway from connection to loss is so deeply carved that they cannot approach one without anticipating the other. This is the wound they brought to you. It is old and it is deep, and it is entirely theirs to heal. The cruel gift of this relationship, this will sound uncomfortable. It's meant to. The avoidant relationship, for all its pain, may be one of the most clarifying experiences you ever have about yourself. Because it surfaced things. It brought attachment wounds of your own to the surface, the places in you that are anxious, that overread silence, that equate withdrawal with abandonment, that learn somewhere along the way that love is conditional and has to be earned by constant performance. The relationship created a mirror, an extremely unflattering, extremely accurate mirror, not to blame you, not to shift the burden of responsibility, but to point at something real, that the reason this particular dynamic hurt as deeply as it did is partly because it activated wounds that were already in you, old wounds that had been managed, covered over, functional, but not healed. The anxious avoidant dynamic doesn't create wounds from nothing. It finds the wounds that are already there and presses on them with extraordinary precision, which means that the grief of this relationship, if you're willing to go all the way into it, carries within it the raw material for a profound reckoning with yourself, with your own attachment history, with what you learned to believe about love and whether those beliefs are actually true. The relationship broke something open. That opening, as agonizing as it is also an invitation. What healing actually looks like here, healing from an avoidant relationship is not a straight line. It doesn't follow a clean arc from pain to acceptance. It's more like tides. There are days where you feel genuinely free, lighter, clearer, more yourself than you've been in months. And then a sound, a smell, a random unmotivated moment, and the grief comes back in full, not diminished, not distant, but somehow just as present as it was in the beginning. That's not relapse. That's not failure. That's what grief does when the love was real. It doesn't disappear in a tidy sequence. It integrates, slowly, unevenly, sometimes invisibly, until one day you realize you went a whole morning without thinking of them, and then a whole day, and then the absence of them becomes less like a wound and more like a scar, still there, just no longer open. Healing here requires some very specific things. It requires that you stop trying to understand their behavior in terms of what it means about you. Their avoidance is a story about them. What you do with it from here, whether you wait, whether you grieve, whether you grow, that is the only story that actually belongs to you. It requires that you grieve not just the relationship, but the version of the relationship you hoped it would become. That future you imagined, that version of them you occasionally glimpsed, because that is often the deeper loss, not what was, but what you could see it becoming if the fear had just loosened its grip. It requires, and this is the hardest one, that you stop trying to make yourself feel less, that you stop treating your own capacity for love as a liability. Because somewhere in this experience, you started to believe that loving deeply and openly was the thing that drove them away. And so the logical response is to love less, to need less, to become more contained, more strategic, more armored. But your capacity for love is not the wound, it is the asset. It went to the wrong address, that's all. The version of you that comes out the other side, there is a you that exists on the other side of this. Not a healed in a straight line, everything is resolved version, but a more integrated one, a more awake one, someone who knows what they feel without immediately questioning whether they're allowed to feel it. Someone who can recognize the early signs of emotional unavailability without needing to fix it or earn their way past it. Someone who understands, viscerally, not just intellectually, that love is not a project, that another person's wounds are not a puzzle for you to solve with enough patience and enough presence and enough self-erasure. Someone who looks at their own depth of feeling and calls it a gift rather than a burden. That version of you is not hypothetical. It is where this pain, if you let yourself fully move through it, is trying to take you. What the avoidant is losing. There is a moment, somewhere in the distance in the quiet life they've returned to, where the avoidant understands what they walked away from. Not always consciously, not always articulately, but the gray comes, the flatness comes, and in the flatness, somewhere beneath the compartmentalization, beneath the self-sufficient narrative they've been running, there is the knowledge of you, what you brought, what it felt like to be in your presence, what it meant to be truly seen by someone who wasn't frightened of what they found. They may never say it, they may never reach back, they may continue building their fortress with you now sealed behind it, a memory instead of a reality. But they know, on the level that can't be argued with or rationalized away, they know. And that matters not because it changes anything practically, not because it means they're coming back, but because you deserve to know that you were not a fool, you were not wrong, you were not alone in what you felt. You loved someone real, and they loved you back, in the most limited and frightened and self-protective way they knew how, and they lost something irreplaceable when they let that fear win. The final thing you need to hear. You have been so patient, so generous in your interpretation of their silences, so willing to hold the complexity of them, to make room for their wounds, to stay soft when every instinct set to harden. That quality in you, that generosity, that willingness to see the human beneath the behavior, is not the thing that failed. It is the thing that will make you an extraordinary partner to someone who is actually ready. But it was never your job to love someone into healing. It was never your job to wait out a fear that they haven't decided to face. It was never your job to make yourself small enough to fit through the narrow crack their walls would allow. You are not a rescue mission. You are not a project. You are not the solution to someone else's avoidance. You are a person who deserves to be loved in full, not carefully, not provisionally, not from behind glass, measured and managed and always just slightly out of reach, in full. And the bad news, the news that has been breaking your heart, is that they loved you. They really did. The connections were real. The moments were real. The love was real. But love, when it lives inside a person who has not yet learned to trust it, cannot reach you. It gets swallowed. It gets rerouted. It gets turned into distance and silence and all the absence you've been standing in the cold of. That is their loss to carry. And your only job now, the only thing that actually matters, is to take everything this cracked you open, everything it revealed about your own depths, everything it taught you about what you need and what you will no longer accept, and walk forward with it, not over them, not despite them, just forward, because somewhere ahead of you is a love that doesn't require you to wonder, that doesn't ask you to earn what you've already earned just by being who you are. That doesn't make you feel like too much, because finally, you will be with someone for whom you're exactly enough. And when that love arrives, you will understand why every closed door led here. You will understand everything. The silence that speaks louder than words. There is something uniquely destabilizing about the silence of an avoidant. Not the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill space. The other kind. The kind that descends like a curtain mid-conversation. The kind that arrives after a moment of real intimacy and swallows it whole. You said something true, something vulnerable, something that came from the deepest part of you, and they went quiet. Not thoughtfully quiet, present in body, absent everywhere else, and you sat in that silence, wondering what you said wrong, replaying the words, editing them in retrospect, wondering if you should have held back, softened it, framed it differently. You started doing the emotional math, calculating how much of yourself you could safely show before the shutters came down. That recalculation, that constant internal editing, is one of the most exhausting things a human being can do inside a relationship, because it means you are never fully present. You are always simultaneously experiencing the moment and monitoring it, always half inside the connection and half standing guard over your own expression, making sure nothing too real slips through. You were not being paranoid. You were responding accurately to an environment that had taught you that full expression came with a cost. And the tragedy is that avoidants often don't know they're creating that environment. They're not engineering your self-censorship. They genuinely don't realize that their withdrawal sends a message, that their quiet communicates danger, that the way they retreat from emotional intensity trains the people who love them to become smaller, more careful, more strategic. Slowly, and without ever being asked directly, the silence wasn't neutral. It never was. The push and pull that rewired you. If you spent any significant amount of time in this dynamic, something happened to your nervous system that you may not have fully named yet. The intermittent nature of the avoidance warmth, present and then absent, close and then distant, open and then sealed, to something very specific to the brain. It creates a pattern of unpredictable reward, and unpredictable reward is neurologically more addictive than consistent reward. The brain lights up harder for something uncertain than for something guaranteed, which means that every time they pulled back and then returned, every time the warmth came back after the cold, your brain registered that as something extraordinary. More extraordinary than if the warmth had simply been consistent the whole time. The relief of their return felt like winning something, and the high of that return became the thing your system started orienting around. You weren't addicted to them because you were weak. You were addicted to them because your nervous system was responding exactly the way nervous system respond to that particular pattern of withdrawal and return. You were chemically, neurologically set up by the dynamic itself. This is important to understand because it explains why leaving, even when you knew it was the right thing, even when the pain was undeniable, felt almost physically impossible. It felt like trying to walk away from something that had become necessary, not just emotionally necessary, biochemically necessary. The longing you felt wasn't just love, it was a nervous system in withdrawal, and healing from this requires understanding that the intensity of what you felt wasn't purely a measure of the relationship's health. Intensity and health are not the same thing. The most intense experiences are sometimes the most dysregulating ones. The person you became around them, look back, honestly, without judgment, at the version of yourself that existed inside this relationship. Were you fully yourself, or were you a carefully managed presentation of yourself, perpetually calibrated to what you believed they could handle? Did you laugh freely, or did you monitor the volume of your laughter? Did you express your needs directly, or did you learn to embed them in questions, to make them smaller, to approach them sideways so they didn't register as demands? Did you feel free to be in a bad mood, to be uncertain, to be human? Or did you feel a constant low-level pressure to be easy, to be low maintenance, to be the kind of person their system wouldn't need to flee from? Most people who have loved and avoidant deeply answer these questions with a particular kind of quiet recognition, because the self-editing happened so gradually, so organically, that it didn't feel like suppression. It felt like accommodation, like being considerate, like meeting them where they were. But accommodation that requires you to consistently suppress your authentic experience is not generosity. It is self-abandonment dressed in the language of love. And the version of yourself that you left behind in that process, the louder, fuller, less carefully managed version, deserves to be reclaimed, piece by piece, not because you owe it to anyone else, but because that version of you is the one that is actually capable of the life you want. Why you chose this and what it reveals, this is the part that requires the most courage to look at. Because if you are honest with yourself, fully uncomfortably honest, the avoidant did not randomly appear in your life. You were drawn to them. Something in you recognized something in them and moved toward it with a certainty that felt like instinct. And that recognition is worth examining, not with shame, not with self-blame, but with genuine curiosity. For many people who fall deeply for avoidance, there is a familiar feeling in the dynamic. Familiar not because it's comfortable, but because it echoes something old. The push and pull mirrors something from childhood, the working to earn warmth, the uncertainty about whether you are truly wanted, the relief that comes when you finally feel chosen. These are emotional patterns that were written early. Perhaps you grew up with a parent whose love was conditional, whose warmth was wonderful, but unpredictable, whose approval had to be earned and could be withdrawn without warning. And somewhere in the encoding of that experience, your nervous system learned that love looks like this. That longing is part of love. That working for someone's consistent affection is just what love requires. So when the avoidant arrived, magnetic, compelling, just slightly out of reach, some deep part of you felt, without words, something like recognition, like coming home to a feeling you already knew. The problem is, you are coming home to a wound rather than a truth. And recognizing that doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It doesn't mean you are broken or destined to repeat this. It means you now have information, profound, useful, genuinely liberating information about yourself, about what you normalized, about what you mistook for depth when it was actually dysregulation, about what your nervous system needs to learn to recognize as love versus what it was trained to chase. That awareness is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the whole thing. The grief beneath the grief. When people talk about grieving an avoidant relationship, they usually mean grieving the person, grieving the connection, grieving the future they imagined. But there is another layer of grief that sits underneath all of that, quieter and more difficult to reach. And until it's acknowledged, the healing stays incomplete. It is the grief of having given so much, of having been so present, so patient, so willing to understand, and having that generosity meet a wall. Not because your generosity was wrong, but because the wall was simply impenetrable from the outside. It is the grief of the investment, the months or years of emotional labor, the sleepless nights trying to decode their behavior, the conversations you rehearsed and then softened, and then sometimes didn't have at all because the risk felt too great. The future you built in your mind, furnished with details, made real through the sheer force of your hope. All of that was real. All of that was yours. And none of it was wasted in the way you think. It was not meaningless, but it also was not received in the way it deserved to be. And you are allowed to grieve that, specifically, loudly if you need to. You are allowed to grieve the version of yourself that kept trying, that kept believing, that stayed soft when every experience said to harden. That person deserves to be honored, not just moved past, because moving past them without honoring them is just another form of self-abandonment. Avoidance is not a life sentence. For all that has been said here about the avoidance fear, about their wounds, about the depth of the conditioning that drives their behavior. None of it is permanent. Avoidant attachment is not destiny, it is a pattern. And patterns, unlike personalities, can change. They change slowly, and they change with sustained effort and willingness. And they change most reliably when the person themselves has decided, not been convinced, not been loved into it, but genuinely decided that the cost of the pattern is too high. Some avoidants reach that decision, often after losing something that finally cracked through the compartmentalization, often after the relief of distance wears off and what's left underneath it is undeniable, often in therapy, in solitude, in the honest reckoning with themselves that they've been postponing for years. When an avoidant does the work, real work, not surface level adjustment but deep attachment repair, they often become extraordinary partners because they understand the machinery of their own avoidance intimately. They can recognize the alarm before they act on it. They can name the deactivating strategies as they arise. They can choose presence consciously and deliberately, even when every old instinct says to retreat. That transformation is real and it is possible. But, and this is the part that cannot be softened, it has absolutely nothing to do with you. It cannot be accelerated by your patience. It cannot be triggered by your love. It cannot be earned by your willingness to wait. The timeline belongs entirely to them, and the decision to begin is entirely theirs. Your love was never the variable. Their readiness is. What you deserve to believe about yourself, now you deserve to walk out of this experience with your sense of self intact, more than intact, sharpened, clarified, more precisely yours than it was before. You deserve to believe that your capacity for deep feeling is a feature of who you are, not evidence of some fatal flaw. That the intensity with which you love is not the reason things went wrong. That your desire for genuine closeness, for reciprocity, for a love that doesn't keep you guessing, these are not excessive demands. They are the minimum conditions for a relationship that is actually healthy. You deserve to believe that the right person, the actually ready person, the person whose nervous system does not experience your love as a threat, will not make you feel like too much, will not need you to manage your expression, will not go quiet when you go deep, will meet you there, will stay. That person exists, not as a fantasy, not as a consolation prize for surviving this, but as a genuine possibility that becomes more accessible the more clearly you understand what you've just been through and what you will and won't accept going forward. You deserve to carry yourself differently now, not harder, not armored, not closed, not strategically unavailable in an attempt to protect yourself by mimicking the very pattern that hurt you, but clearer, more boundaried, more able to recognize early what kind of attachment you're walking into, and more willing to trust what you feel when something is off, because you know now. You know what it feels like when someone is present but unreachable. You know the particular texture of love that lives behind glass. You know the specific exhaustion of being with someone whose warmth is real, but whose capacity for sustained intimacy hasn't caught up with their feelings. You will not miss those signs again, not because you've become cynical, but because you've become awake. The love that is still in you here is the last thing. Everything you poured into this relationship, every act of patience, every moment of genuine understanding, every time you chose to see the human behind the behavior instead of simply reacting to the behavior itself, none of that disappeared when the relationship ended. It is still in you, all of it. The love didn't go anywhere. It didn't get used up or wasted or destroyed. It is still there, waiting, the way water waits, not diminished by having been poured, but ready to flow again when the right ground appears. You are not depleted. You are not damaged beyond repair. You are not someone who has given too much and has nothing left. You are someone who has loved at full capacity and survived the experience of that love, meeting a wall. And that survival, that stubborn insistence on remaining open even after being hurt, is one of the rarest and most valuable things a person can be. The world does not need more closed people. It does not need more guarded, strategic, half-present versions of love. It needs exactly what you have: the willingness to feel fully, to love without a safety net, to show up without guarantees. Take that with you, not toward them, not backward, forward into a life and a love that finally knows what to do with it. That is not the ending. That is where you actually begin.